Good evening and welcome to the 2022 Sir James Plimsoll Lecture, brought to you as part of the University of Tasmania's Island of Ideas online public lecture series, in partnership with the Tasmanian branch of the Australian Institute of International Affairs and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. A very special welcome to our honoured guests this evening. Bryce Wakefield, the National Executive Director of the Australian Institute of International Affairs, Kim Boyer, the President of the Tasmanian branch of the Australian Institute of International Affairs, Tim Alt, the Director of the Tasmanian State Office of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Alison Watkins, the Chancellor of the University of Tasmania, and perhaps most importantly, a very warm welcome to Kathleen Plimsoll, niece of Sir James Plimsoll, and her son, Christian Plimsoll Kanak, who have travelled from Sydney to be with us today. We cherish our relationship with the Plimsoll family and extend our ongoing appreciation to Kathleen, Christian, and other members of the Plimsoll family. As a reflection of our institution's recognition of the deep history and culture of this island, the University of Tasmania wishes to acknowledge the traditional owners of Lutruwita, Tasmania, the Muwinina, and the Palawa people. The Palawa are the original and traditional custodians of the land from which we are broadcasting today, from Nipaluna, also known as Hobart. We pay our deepest respect to elders past and present, and to those who did not make elder status. We acknowledge the deep histories of storytelling, knowledge sharing, and caring for this land. And if you are joining us online tonight, please do share your acknowledgements of country by typing into the Q&A function, which is located at the bottom of the Zoom window. That will be just one of the opportunities we have for interaction with our online audience. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the University of Tasmania. My name is Professor Nicholas Farrelly, and it's my great honour to serve as Head of Social Sciences here at the University, where I lead a diverse interdisciplinary team. And I think from our university's perspective, we are particularly proud that our analysts and researchers play a key role in understanding Tasmania's place in the world. Of course, a theme of great interest to Sir James Plimsoll as his career developed. For this evening, and just as we're getting started, I have a few quick housekeeping notes. I would like to, of course, ensure that our broadcast this evening is as smooth as possible. We are going out live to Australia and indeed to the world. So for those of us fortunate enough to be in the room for the 2022 Plimsoll Lecture, can I please ask you just to take a moment to switch your mobile phone onto silent, or perhaps to turn it off, so that we can avoid any interruptions. And in the event of an emergency here in the room, please do follow our event staff who will guide you through the nearest exit, and then we'll meet out on the oval near Grosvenor Crescent. That is our emergency plan. For our distant but valued online viewers, please note that your microphone, camera, chat function, and raised hand function have all been disabled for this evening to protect your privacy. We do, however, invite you to ask questions, and this can be done at any time by typing them into the Q&A function, which you can see on the bottom of your screen. And they'll in fact come straight through to my phone, where I'll be able to keep track of all of the ideas and questions that emerge. You can, of course, type your questions in and keep yourself anonymous if you would like. We will seek to do whatever we can to address as many questions as possible, both from our audience online and from all of you here in the room. Finally, it is worth mentioning that this lecture is being recorded as well as going out live, such that it will be accessible on YouTube and SoundCloud. And what we'll do at the end of tonight's proceedings is that we'll make sure everybody has those details to share. So with enough of the housekeeping out of the way, I'm delighted to be able to invite the Chancellor, Alison Watkins, to introduce tonight's Plimsoll Lecture and our distinguished lecturer. Chancellor.
Thank you, Nicholas. And on behalf of the University of Tasmania, first let me express a very, very sincere and heartfelt welcome to you all as we gather, some of us online and some of us here in this room, for the 2022 Sir James Plimsoll Lecture. The distinguished Australian diplomat in whose memory the Plimsoll Lecture is delivered has frequently been described as the most impressive diplomat in the history of Australian international relations. After serving in the Australian Imperial Force in World War II, Sir James was appointed to the Far Eastern Commission, tasked with overseeing the Allied Council for Japan during the occupation of that country. In 1950, he was sent as the Australian representative to the United Nations Commission for the Unification and Rehabilitation of Korea, where he formed a close working relationship with Syngman Rhee, the South Korean president. Sir James was appointed as Australia's permanent representative to the United Nations in 1959 and became Australia's High Commissioner to India and Ambassador to Nepal in 1962. He was chosen to be head of the Department of External Affairs in 1965. Sir James held roles as Ambassador to the United States, the USSR, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the EEC, and High Commissioner to the United Kingdom. His final diplomatic post was as Ambassador to Japan in 1981 and 82. Following his diplomatic career, Sir James served as a highly popular and respected Governor of Tasmania from 1982 until his death in May 1987. Apparently, very early in his career, Sir James applied for the position of Professor of Economics here at the University of Tasmania. Our decision not to appoint him led to the incredible career that followed. And we can only speculate about what might have been for our university but for that decision. When he was Governor of Tasmania, Sir James took a great interest in the university, occasionally coming in unannounced to browse in the university bookshop, and he was awarded an honorary doctorate not long before he died. 20 years after his passing in 2005, the Australian Institute of International Affairs, the Department of Foreign Affairs, and the University of Tasmania announced that they would sponsor an annual Sir James Plimsoll Lecture in Hobart. And I'm sure it was probably more than a little controversial that the lecture was not to be held in Canberra. Sir James's contribution to the university, the state, the country, and to the world is profound, and it's with deep respect and pride that the Australian Institute of International Affairs, the university, and the department present this lecture series in Hobart and in his name. The first Plimsoll Lecture was delivered in 2007 by the Honourable Alexander Downer, MP, then Minister for Foreign Affairs. I'm sure we're all delighted to be here 15 years after the inaugural event, to be enjoying the 2022 Sir James Plimsoll Lecture, which is entitled The Decade Ahead, Disruptive, Disorderly and Dangerous. What an alluring title, and also what an important and exciting lecture we're in for. There's certainly been no shortage of disruption, disorder, and dangerous times in recent years, and plenty more lies ahead, as we know. Indeed, this series, this Island of Ideas public lecture series, is framed partly in response to the recent disruption from COVID that we've had. It began in 2020 by moving to moving from the traditional lecture format to an online format when, of course, we were unable to gather in person. And we're now in 2022 in a hybrid format, hoping that we can connect Tasmania's community and research to people across our regions and into a global network of ideas and emerging issues. This lecture has become more accessible than ever before, and we're very proud of that because connection and conversation are a vital part of our university's role in the community and core to our values. I know that tonight's lecture will inspire us and help us imagine and build a brighter future for Tasmania and beyond. And it's my great honour to introduce Dr. Heather Smith, who's our guest lecturer tonight. Prior to the recent announcement of her April 2023 appointment as the National President of the Australian Institute of International Affairs, Dr. Heather Smith had a distinguished career in the Australian public service, academia and business. In addition to holding senior appointments in Treasury, the Office of National Assessments, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, she served as Secretary of the Departments of Communications and the Arts and Industry, Innovation and Science. In October 2013, she was appointed by Prime Minister Abbott as Australia's G20 Sherpa, overseeing Australia's presidency of the G20 in 2014. She's also been a member of the advisory panel to Prime Minister Gillard's White Paper, Australia and the Asian Century. Heather's previously served on several government boards, including Innovation and Science Australia, the CSIRO, the Australian Nuclear Science Technology Organisation, and the Australian Institute of Marine Science. Heather is currently a professor in the National Security College at the ANU and a non-executive director of ASX Limited and Challenger Limited. She's also a deputy chair of the United States Studies Centre, a director of China Matters, and a member of the Bretton Woods Committee. In 2021, she was chair of the independent panel undertaking a review into the Australian public sector hierarchy and classification system. She's also a member of the Westpac Scholars National Selection Panel and a member of Chief Executive Women. Please join me in welcoming our truly distinguished speaker tonight, Dr. Heather Smith.
Well, good evening. Good evening, everyone. Can I begin by acknowledging Chancellor Alison Watkins, also Professor Nicholas Farrelly and other members of the University faculty, Bruce Wakefield, National Executive Director of the Australian Institute of International Affairs, Kim Boyer, President of the Tasmania branch of the Australian Institute of International Affairs, Kim Alt, Director, Tasmanian State Office, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Distinguished guests, can I particularly acknowledge members of the Plimsoll family here tonight, Kathleen and Christian, again for travelling from Sydney to join us. That's terrific. Thank you. Distinguished guests and ladies and gentlemen, I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past and present. I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people present with us today. It is an absolute honour to be here in Hobart at the University of Tasmania to deliver the 2022 Sir James Plimsoll Lecture. It's also humbling to be following in the footsteps of so many truly distinguished speakers. Previous speakers have been understandably inspired by the life and career of Sir James. Yet most, like me, never had the opportunity or the honour of actually knowing him. That's quite a striking thought, an impact of someone that extends well beyond one's own present. Sir James truly was an extraordinary Australian. He was part of an exceptional generation of intellectually gifted post-war public servants who made Australia and the world a better and safer place by virtue of their commitment and service. Previous speakers have shared their reflections of Sir James' long career that spanned from the end of World War II to just before the end of the Cold War. That career culminated, of course, in his serving as the Governor of Tasmania from 1985 to 1987, so 1982 to 1987, a role that he discharged for the people of Tasmania in the same way that he represented Australia, with total dedication. In reading Jeremy Hedder's biography, I was intrigued by how Sir James, trained in economics, came to move so easily between the strategic, foreign, economic and political dimensions of policy, and to have such a significant and enduring impact on Australia's place in the world. Two formative experiences might help to explain this. The first was Sir James's recruitment by Sir Alfred Davidson into the economics department of the Bank of New South Wales, with a mission to promote collective thinking about safer and more equitable Australia. It seems obvious to say that we are living in a period of unprecedented turbulence, a confluence of events that we have not witnessed in the past 3/4 of a century. It is this lack of historical parallels that makes the decade ahead so fraught. Neither our political leaders nor their bureaucratic advisors have experience in facing any of the current challenges, let alone all of them in combination. As the world grapples with the ongoing impact of the pandemic, Russia's unwarranted and illegal invasion of Ukraine, high and potentially sustained inflation, a global slowdown and the breakdown of global supply chains, our regional and global order is being remade. We are now living in a world lacking in strategic trust. There is a real possibility of a splintering into democratic and authoritarian spheres of geopolitical influence. More than a third of the global economy will contract this year or next as growth in the largest economies, the US, EU and China, stall. Growth in global trade is slowing sharply and is projected next year to be around half the average of the last 50 years. We are living through a resurgence of inflation for the first time in 3 decades, as the supply side interdependence of the effects of the pandemic, Russia's invasion of the Ukraine and geopolitics manifest. The world has never experienced an inflationary surge and the related policy response with such historically high public debt levels. The energy crisis of higher prices and reduced supply flowing from Russia's actions is unlikely to be a transitory shock and has triggered a global realignment of energy supplies. Interestingly, it is triggering both greater short-term investment in fossil fuel energy sources and the acceleration in the move to low and zero emission sources of energy. And after years characterised by declining income inequality between countries and widening inequality within countries, we are now in a scenario of a widening of income inequality both within and between countries. This is sobering, with real consequences for social cohesiveness. Even demographic trends, which are usually baked into the long-run growth trajectory of a nation's decades before, have been startlingly all altered in ways that could have economic and geopolitical implications. In the United States, the combination of the pandemic and the opioid crisis has seen US life expectancy fall below that of China and several other developing countries. This is truly unprecedented. At the same time, China's sustained lockdown and slowing economy has raised again the worry of the 2000s. Will China grow old before it grows rich? In my own view, this is a given. The deteriorating geopolitical environment, much of it China's own making, along with the tendency to increasingly subjugate economic decisions to political control, will slow China's potential growth. This will lead to less productive domestic investment, less foreign investment, and the stymie of innovation. The consequences of which will be China mired in the middle income trap as we move in the 2030s. Some have described our world as being in a polycrisis, one that affects everyone. As Adam Tooze notes, no one is outside the current conjecture. There are different vantage points with different perspectives, but no single point and no single theory that encompasses our reality. This reinforces my earlier point that our political leaders and their policy advisors are in uncharted waters. As the pandemic demonstrated all too starkly, there seems little prospect of global coordination on issues of the global commons at a time when these shared challenges are increasing in their complexity and consequence. Well before the pandemic struck, there were clear signs that the existing architecture of the international system had run its course. The diffusion of power from the developed to the developing world made it harder to reach multilateral consensus on shared challenges. Witness, for example, the continued failure to effectively address climate change. In the wake of the global financial crisis, the failure in both developed and developing countries to appreciate the benefit of strong institutions, open trade, the role of responsible monetary and fiscal policy, and the importance of structural reform coincided with the global rise of populist anti-establishment politics. This was driven in part by the abandonment in many countries of sensible redistributive policies that would allow all to share in the benefits of growth. Instead, rising inequality within countries led to disillusionment with the fundamental drivers of prosperity. The American public in particular began to believe that the globalised international system no longer served their interests. While there's been long been a streak of isolationism in the American body politic, in recent decades this has been nurtured by the sense of lost opportunity and the absence of pathways to a better life. All of these factors will all manifest in the decision to elect Donald Trump as president. And while the West focused elsewhere, China's leadership was spurred on by what it assessed as the structural decline of the West, and in particular Pax Americana. Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative in 2013 symbolised the beginning of a new Chinese international assertiveness. Looking back, the period from 2013 to 2017 turns out to have been a pivotal period, as Xi Jinping set out his roadmap for China to become the preeminent Asian regional power and a global peer of the United States by the mid-2030s, and as Washington officially labelled China a strategic competitor. When President Trump came to power in 2017, the US National Intelligence Council Global Trends Report, which is prepared at the start of each US administration, looked out to 2035 and called out that the world was confronting a paradox. The industrial and information age was shaping a world both more dangerous and yet richer with opportunities. The unipolar moment had passed, and the commitment to the post-1945 rules-based order was being eroded. It foresaw and emboldened China and Russia, and that the deep shifts in the global landscape portended a dark and difficult future. 5 years on, and after 75 years of global economic integration, the hope that interdependence would lead to peace and prosperity has again been turned on its head, as it was in the 1930s. Worse, the economic policies and increasing connectedness that have lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty and delivered an intergenerational doubling of living standards have now been weaponised. As Danny Roderick recently put it, it seems the great powers are now handing the keys to the global economy to their national security establishments, jeopardising both global peace and prosperity. The world is experiencing a paradigm shift, but while we know what we are leaving behind, we have no idea what we are moving toward. What we do know is that over this decade, Australia will be pushed and pulled by 4 interrelated forces: deglobalisation and the ongoing distributive backlash, geostrategic competition and the struggle against authoritarianism, the 4th industrial revolution and techno-nationalism, global decarbonisation and energy transformation. Let me briefly expand on these forces. To some commentators, a new world is emerging in which economic convergence is over
and deglobalisation and protectionism under the guise of strategic resilience threaten to deliver lower living standards for all. To others, such as Ian Bremmer, globalisation itself is not fraying, but is adrift due to the absence of leadership. We are in a global political recession. And while the world will be less coordinated and efficient, a new settling point will emerge because interconnectedness is still in most countries' interests, given how bad the alternatives are. Either way, a different model of globalisation will unfold, one that involves a rebalancing towards labour over capital, the dominance of the digital global economy, albeit bifurcated and without the global architecture that helped both facilitate and govern the flows of trade and capital in the 20th century. Inevitably, there will be a reweighting towards economic security and resilience over efficiency and markets as governments become more interventionist, subjugating the drivers of economic growth to political direction. If I'm correct, the next decade will be a period of transformation of global supply chains. While global value chains accounting for half of all trade and autocracies on some measures accounting for around 1/3 of global GDP, more diversification in supply chains and deconcentration of world markets looks inevitable. If done with restraint, it could change the global economy for the better in terms of the balance between openness, fairness, and resilience. Done badly, it would lead to sustained higher prices and slower, more uneven growth, and lower living standards than what otherwise would be the case. The biggest unknown for Australia is whether in this multipolar world, the US and China can coexist as both strategic rivals and partners for cooperation on critical issues of the global commons. Unfortunately, the sense is one of growing fatalism that such a balance may be unachievable. The US and China appear to have now entered the grey zone in the contest for global primacy. We are neither at war nor at peace. China had already made its intentions clear, but now the US is unambiguously on a pathway of containment of China. The previous diplomatic language that the US would not interfere in China's development has been overturned as the US now openly seeks to stymie China's economic and military rise. This is most visible in the ramping up of technological confrontation as the US moves to constrain access to foundational technologies such as microchips. This is a profound shift. The result will likely be a doubling down by China of its quest for self-sufficiency in a range of technologies, the prospect of tit-for-tat retaliation, and the further undermining of the prospects for cooperation on mutual global challenges. For Australia, harnessing the benefits of technology while protecting our national security in this era of major power rivalry will be particularly challenging. As a net importer of both capital and technology, we are dependent on the global technological supply chain. As we navigate the consequences of US-China competition, we will need to be constantly weighing up the trade-offs we will have to make between national security, societal license, and the economic benefits of open innovation. When it comes to protecting technology, building a high fence around a small garden or using a scalpel rather than a sledgehammer sounds rhetorically easy, but it isn't. Our government and businesses are struggling with this balance. And it will become harder if those tensions spill over into other arenas, traditionally characterised by greater cooperation. For a jurisdiction whose exports are heavily influenced by regional developments, this should be an issue for all Tasmanians. Similarly, the Australian Antarctic Division could increasingly see its role in the Antarctic more and more shaped by geopolitical tensions. Over the last decade, much of our policy deliberations on technology have been seen through the lens of national security. But policies taken in isolation of our economic interests are likely to be self-limiting for a country like Australia, given our historic inability to build industries at global scale, the small size of our domestic market, and our dependence on global research linkages. Building resilience into some of our critical supply chains, as the pandemic has shown, makes sense, as does working with trusted suppliers where input markets are grossly distorted, such as in energy and critical minerals. Such changes take on even more importance in the face of economic coercion. But going beyond this only makes us less secure, will carry a penalty in terms of productivity and growth, and see us in danger of replicating some of the market-distorting policies that Australia's economic reforms of the 1980s had to unwind. In the end, Australia cannot escape the fact that its prosperity has been built on well-functioning, transparent global markets. This is unlikely to change. Although we have so far weathered China's economic coercion, it is unrealistic to think that we or much of our region can decouple completely from China and the complex interdependence of its trade, investment, and financial linkages. While much of what I have just said constitute challenges to our future prosperity and security, the story is not all one of gloom. The decarbonisation of the global economy, driven by investors and consumers, is a source of massive opportunity for Australia. We truly have the potential to be a renewable energy superpower and to build new, globally competitive industries on the back of our energy, mineral, and agricultural abundance. That, however, will require a clear-eyed, long-term strategic vision of our economy based on a bipartisanship that is presently lacking. The three pillars that have underwritten our security and prosperity for decades, our alliance with the United States, the multilateral system, and our economic integration with the Indo-Pacific, are now being reshaped and redefined. It will be challenging for Australia to make our way in this new world. It will test our statecraft as we calibrate in ways we have never had to do before. The multidimensional challenges we face require a toolkit, similarly that needs to be multifaceted as we both mitigate risk and position ourselves for advantage. We will need to conceive of national power in a more subtle and nuanced manner, one that involves our military power projection, economic vitality and flexibility, our social cohesion, not one of these alone. Forged through battle and underpinned by our shared values and deep strategic and economic ties, Australia's alliance with the United States will remain the central pillar of our security and prosperity. Some question whether the US's value proposition to the rest of the world is now fading. Yet, for all its domestic tensions, the US is for the foreseeable future the only country with a worldview and the capability to project power globally. Notwithstanding the slight thawing in our relationship, it would be a perilous path for Australia to bet on any change in China's aggressive behaviour anytime soon, as Xi Jinping continues China's quest for national rejuvenation, even as his Marxist-Leninist model, with its inherent weaknesses, may look self-defeating to us. This period, while the struggle is underway and before the outcome is clear, is a time for Australia to consider the complex choices we face. We need to think about the principles that should guide our approach to multilateralism, a multilateralism that works for the mid-20th century, balancing our dependence on open and transparent markets with the building of a more resilient regional and global order. In our region, we will need to persuade and project influence through a networked grid of alliances, partnerships and institutions to both reinforce a regional order that has been stable, peaceful and prosperous, and deter an emerging order inimical to the factors that have underpinned the Indo-Pacific success. Reliance on trusted partners, sometimes based on common values such as AUKUS, sometimes on common interests such as the Quad, will be an important part of this networked approach. But the wariness with which AUKUS is viewed by some in our region means we will need a multi-pronged approach to engaging within the Indo-Pacific. Working collectively and bilaterally with regional partners such as Japan, the Republic of Korea, India, Southeast Asia and the Pacific Island states will require a sustained effort. The concerted focus by the Albanese government to build deeper and more robust relationships with ASEAN and the Pacific is to be applauded. Both regions will be arenas of strategic competition, and we need to recognise that economic development rather than strategic hedging will remain the prime objective for many countries. To that end, we must recognise that what we do at home to strengthen our economy will be just as important to our security and prosperity as how we engage the world. In the absence of new drivers of growth, the rate of increase in Australia's quality of life will fall. Our ability to project power will diminish, and the relative attractiveness of our political and economic model will decline. Raising our productivity performance through supply-side reforms should be just as an urgent undertaking as is our defence planning. The Treasury now assumes that a decade from now, our productivity growth is unlikely to exceed the long-run average of 1.2% per year, and that it will require significant economic reforms to achieve even this. Treasury has been making this point for many years, but neither the political class nor the community appear inclined to act until it is too late. The fact that our living standards haven't fallen precipitously has been due to big shifts in commodity prices and terms of trade. But relying on repeated bouts of luck hardly comprises sensible policy. The reforms needed to lift productivity have been well documented and debated. What hasn't been debated but needs to be are the trade-offs that we as a nation need to make as we build resilience at home and abroad, and the importance of a sustained focus on deterrence as we ratchet up spending on our defence capability. Like other Asian democracies, unless we lift economic growth, we will be unable to make these trade-offs without difficult decisions to raise taxes or reduce spending. It's unlikely that many of us will see another budget surplus in our lifetime, as health, ageing, social welfare and increasing defence spending consume an increasing share of the nation's resources. Post the pandemic, we also now have a smaller, older population than we previously anticipated, with a higher dependency ratio and a much larger stock of debt. The net result of these factors is a heightened vulnerability to what looks like a prolonged period of geopolitical uncertainty. Our position will remain perilous without sustained, forward-thinking political leadership. We will need to be more clear-eyed about our national interests than currently. In its simplest form, the national interest should be about ensuring security, prosperity and social cohesion of the nation and its people today and into the future. But different sections of Australian society place different weights and priorities in terms of security, prosperity and social cohesion. And there is no shared understanding of the costs we are prepared to pay to achieve each. In my view, it's time for Australia to adopt a national interest strategy, or at the very least a national statement that brings together an integrated and balanced understanding of the national interest, incorporating our security, economic and societal interests. Such a strategy would help bring clearer policy frameworks to decision-making by better connecting the principles that guide our domestic economic interests, markets, institutions, social well-being, with the principles that underpin our national security, our interests, values, identity and history. It would also better connect our arms of government that engage in periodic long-range planning. Indeed, how we organise our national decision-making structures and processes may be just as important as the postures that we adopt. Our new reality also demands a more inclusive national conversation on Australia's strategic circumstances. The era when strategic policy was pursued behind closed doors has passed. The threats we face and the difficult choices our elected leaders will have to make on our behalf call for more, not less, public discussion because of the profound intergenerational implications. The signs are encouraging with the new government's recent levelling with the Australian people on our economic challenges, but there needs to be matched by similar openness about our strategic circumstances. Only by drawing these two together can the public truly understand the choices in front of us. 100 years ago, Iliai Root, former Secretary of War and Secretary of State in the US, in reflecting on the lessons of the Great War in the very first issue of the Journal of Foreign Affairs in 1922, spoke to the pressing demand for open diplomacy and popular education in international affairs. He said, democracies determined to control their own destinies object to being led without their knowledge into situations where they have no choice. As a gifted communicator, Sir James, while serving under Foreign Minister Sir Paul Hasluck, recognised the importance of communicating with the public on strategic and foreign policy. This annual lecture series is an important part of engaging with Australians on the difficult choices Australia faces, not only in the decades ahead, but even more importantly, those we face in the near term. The role that the Australian Institute of International Affairs plays in this public discussion has never been more important. As President-elect, I hope to see the AIIA's role and contribution to the national discourse enhanced. Finally, for the students here tonight, the decade ahead will be a decisive one in shaping your life. We will need leaders, including you, of great character, courage, wisdom and judgment. You could do no better than look to James Plimsoll as a role model. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Wonderful. And apologies to our participants online for the challenges of the audio earlier. I understand that I sounded like Donald Duck. So I hope, ladies and gentlemen, I'm coming through loud and clear now. I'll look for the thumbs up from the back of the room. Thank you once again, Heather, for a magnificent 2022 Sir James Plimsoll Lecture, and thank you for sharing so generously of your insights. I'm going to be keeping a close eye on our Q&A panel coming in through Zoom, and I'd be delighted to get some more questions from those who are joining us online this evening, and I can see some questions coming through. I think we also have a microphone that's going to be moving around the room here for our audience members. And so I'm really keen that we can draw on some comments from here at Sandy Bay as well. Our first question comes, Heather, from the Zoom room and from Luther. And I'll just read it out because I think it's an important question to set some of the terms of our further discussion tonight. Luther says, you differentiated between cooperation based on values and cooperation based on interests. Isn't it true that one of the reasons our, i.e. the West's, value propositions have suffered is that we have prioritised interests over values far too many times? Is this something we could have another look at? What do you think, Heather?
Thank you for that question. It's a terrific question and a really hard one to actually answer. So I think, if you think about what is the national interest, and you think about what is your not working? Yeah. I think, your national interest is really how you balance your risks with your opportunities. But within that, values are front and centre. But we've sort of had, I think, an ongoing debate in foreign policy circles for a long time about, how you think about values. And it's clearly important to how, a country, a democratic system and all the features that underline that democratic system. But we also have interests, and those interests can be interchangeable over time. When it comes to foreign policy, clearly our interests lie in a stable, possible, regional and global order, and we want institutions that support that. And we will work with far more partners where we share interests, but also where we're not always aligned on values. And I think we are in this world, and you can see that, I guess, with how the US engages in its diplomacy, where we have to do both. But it's a really important question. I guess that's why I raised the notion of why Australia should think about having a national interest strategy, because these are the sort of issues that need to be debated, because the makeup of Australian society has changed substantially, over generations. And different parts of society have very different I think, interpretations of what are our values and interests. So that's why I raised that issue about having a national conversation. I'm not sure I answered the question because it's a toughie, but it's the one that we should actually be discussing.
Great, thanks very much, Heather. Before we come to questions here in the room, I just have one more quick one from Martine in the Zoom room. And she asks, and it follows, I think, quite neatly here, Heather, how important is it for Australia to deepen its economic engagement with the region, including in particular through a more robust investment effort to demonstrate true commitment? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think it's imperative. I mean, our future has always lay in the region in terms of our economic prosperity and the complementarity that we bring through the structure of our economy. I think we've had, quite bifurcated approaches to investment in the region. That we know that we've had a lot of flows of investment from Japan, China, Korea, but our investment in Southeast Asia has not been as strong over time. So I think there is a concerted push to really, look for opportunities in Southeast Asia where going forward it is both, as I mentioned, both the economic and strategic epicenter of the region, particularly with Indonesia. It's an area that we need to do more as a country. As I said, we're a net importer of capital into Australia. We rely on capital markets, and with East Asia being the strongest growing part of the world going forward, despite the pandemic, and I include Indonesia, obviously, in that, it's imperative that we keep looking for investment opportunities and we still be as open as possible to investment from the region.
Great, thanks, Heather. We'll take a question in the room, please. Thank you. We'll go to you first. If I could just ask you to briefly identify yourself and just keep your question as succinct as possible, please. Thank you.
Peter Davison-Galley. I'm a philosopher by trade, not a political scientist, and ethics is one of my stamping grounds. I was also snagged by the national interest stuff. It seems to me entirely conceivable that the right and proper thing for us to do as a nation on occasion is sacrifice our national interest for some greater good. The alternative, instead of moral impartialism, is moral partialism or tribalism or selfishness, or call it what you wish. So your national interest stuff, by all means, identify the national interest. I'm just not at all clear that one should always follow it.
Heather.
I think. Thank you for the comment. I think there's a lot of debate about whether it's a national security strategy or whether it's a national interest strategy within the circles that talk about this a lot. And I think because what I raised in the speech is because of the choices that are coming. I think, as you mentioned, when you think about the US and China and the impact on Australia, that the US really focusing on wanting to retain its preeminence in the Indo-Pacific, that raises all sorts of questions for Australia. Obviously, there's issues around how we engage with China, the future of Taiwan, the reference I made to much more of a focus on restricting technology. All of those will present choices for Australia going forward. And I think it's important to actually start to have these conversations about, so that people aren't surprised. Now, some people say you shouldn't have a strategy like this because it holds a government to account. But that's not the point. It's actually talking about the forces that I mentioned, that there are real trade-offs coming in our standard of living and in our geopolitical environment. And we've yet to really have that national conversation. And it can be quite fraught, but I think it's a necessary thing you'd expect in a democracy.
Thanks, Heather. I think we have some more questions here in the room, and I'll wait for the microphone to come around. Just while we are waiting, Heather, a question here in the Zoom room from Zara. She says, Heather, you say that you don't think we will see a federal budget surplus in our lifetime. Are you happy that we are passing the costs of our current government expenditure to the next generation? It's, again, a tricky question, but an important one for all of us. What do you think?
Thanks, Zara. I think it goes a little bit to the previous question as well. That no, I don't think we should be happy that we're passing that intergenerational debt and fiscal circumstances to the next generation. But again, these are choices that we elect politicians to make on our behalf, and we do have to make some tough decisions around where we put our spending, and that goes to: are we going to raise taxes? How do we make the trade-offs between rapidly aging population and social welfare? So yes, if you're now a young person and you think, well, high levels of public debt, higher interest rates, very hard to get into the housing market. You do see those statistics that in the US, where someone born in the US today, has very little chance of having a higher living standard than their parents. So hence those questions around productivity, the need to undertake reforms to generate growth so that you can have higher living standards. That should be something that, really should be part of that national conversation about what is your national interest, both on the economic side and the strategic side.
Thanks, Heather. We'll take a question, a brief one from here at the front, and then if I possibly can, we'll move through two more questions here in the room. Over to you. Thank you.
The Yemeni war, can you tell me why this is not covered like the Ukraine-Russian war in Australia? There seems to be a bit of a de facto war going on, and it's never ever covered here in Australia in particular.
I don't know that I can answer that question. There is, because I guess we're in back to a Cold War type scenario where it's easy to bifurcate the world between authoritarian states and the West, with Russia and China and the Yemeni war, which you clearly know more than I do about that. Has been one of those sort of ongoing wars that just do not get the same attention, even though obviously the human rights issues and all of that are just as egregious. So I think I would just suggest that there's a lot going on in the world, and that's these polycrises, which I quite like that term that Adam Tooze, who's a professor at Columbia University, uses to just how the interrelationship of all these crises makes it really hard to sort of focus on what to do, what policy response to use now, and what will be the unintended consequences. So I suspect it's just the world is really complicated and complex at this point in our history, notwithstanding the ongoing wars that we've been having for many, many years.
Thanks, Heather. Yes, we'll take a question here. Thank you very much.
Hello, Dr. Smith. Thank you very much for that very, very fascinating and very dense coverage. Harriet Bailey from the Australian Antarctic Division. Thank you for the reference to our ongoing challenges in the geopolitical space. I actually wanted to explore pick up a few of those threads in relation to climate change. Obviously, it is an issue that very much the younger generation is seized of, and the whole world is seized of. You didn't touch on it too much. Obviously, it's one of the polycrises. But I just wanted to pick up a little bit of what you said about, that kind of the choice about growth and living standards. And that's all obviously for us as, highly Western nation, all interlinked. And I just wanted to sort of, hear a little bit what your thoughts are and how that interplays into, the crisis that we really are having now.
Thank you. You could not come to Tasmania and not talk about the Antarctic Division. So I'm so happy to be here for that. Look, there are
coming back to some of the discussion about, the intergenerational challenges and who won't see, good fiscal circumstances in their lifetime. But, there are enormous opportunities if we get it right in terms of decarbonisation. And I think, we're on a reasonable path now, and we're back at the international table, which is terrific. And there's obviously commitments there going forward. But I think, we've learned some lessons in Australia about how do you deal with transition, as you move through disruption of people's lives. And we do need to think about the unintended consequences of some of the policies, as we wind down fossil fuels and as we build renewables. It takes some really clever integrated policy coordination to make that happen. And I guess that's why my theme of sort of thinking about how institutions interact is that you really need to bring everyone to the table to co-design responses and have conversations early, whether it's through transition in regions with coal-fired power stations, offering alternatives of transition, as well as talking about, clearly the energy and opportunities we have going forward. So, it's not a zero sum for Australia. It's enormous opportunities, but there will be transitions, and you can see that political debate playing out.
Thanks very much, Heather. And I've got a screen full of questions that have come in online, and I know there are more questions here in the room. I've also been given the time is up signal, so you can appreciate the predicament that the chair is in. And on that note, can you join me in thanking Heather with a big round of applause, please? Thank you, Heather. And now to extend a more formal vote of thanks, I would like to invite Dr. Tim Alt, the Director of the Tasmania State Office of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Tim, yes, please.
Distinguished guests, friends and colleagues, on behalf of the many partners that underpin the prestigious Sir James Plimsoll Lecture series, and that includes the University of Tasmania, the Australian Institute of International Affairs, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and very especially to the Plimsoll family that have travelled here today. It gives me great pleasure to thank Dr. Heather Smith for a fascinating and insightful lecture, and a very interesting. Gosh, you got some doozy questions, I must say, at the end there. I mean, I think we would all agree we are entering a very disruptive, disorderly, and dangerous decade. And thinking about the many challenges that you referenced, it will be easy to become disquieted, dour, and downright depressed, to be frank. I noted some of them down: climate change, the ongoing COVID pandemic, war and conflict, not only in Ukraine, but in Yemen, in Myanmar, and various other places in the world, food and energy insecurity, surging inflation, supply chain bottlenecks, erosion of the global rules-based order, and perhaps even a failing trust in democracy in many parts of the world. As you point out, we are in uncharted waters, and we need to be clear-eyed and prepared for these challenges in the next decade. I just, very briefly, I too, I think one of the questions was about climate change. You did touch on that. I think, given where we are, we really we can't let that pass. I mean, we are in the University of Tasmania, which this year, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Nicholas, the Times Higher Education Impact Rankings rated University of Tasmania number one of all the education institutions in the world, not Australia, in the world, thousands of institutions, number one in climate action. And in fact, Tasmania itself as a state is already a global leader in decarbonising its economy. It really is an example to the nation as climate change is an area where Australia can not only improve its international reputation, but become a world leader. Tasmania produces 100% of its electricity needs from renewable resources. It has legislated targets to produce 150% by 2030 and 200% by 2040. Within the next decade, there will be surplus renewables powering a green hydrogen export industry, greening and firming up the national electricity market. And I think the most exciting of all, I can see big, traditionally heavy industries, power-hungry investors coming to Tasmania, not because power is cheap. Anyone who lives in Tasmania knows power is not cheap here anymore, but it's green. And within 10 years' time, I have no doubt that Tasmania will be producing green zinc, green aluminium, and will be selling those at a premium on global markets. So the message I take home from your presentation is that we are living in unprecedented times. I don't think there's been so much global uncertainty since the end of the Cold War, and we need to meet those challenges with clear eyes and a strategic perspective. So thank you very much for your presentation, and please join me in thanking Dr. Heather Smith.
Thanks very much, Dr. Tim Olds. I'd now like to invite Bryce Wakefield, the National Executive Director of the Australian Institute of International Affairs, to make a presentation. Please, Bryce.
Very good. Thank you, everybody. At the risk of repetition, I do want to thank the University of Tasmania and the Chancellor, Alison Watkins, for hosting not only this event, but several of the events of the AIIA Tasmania branch. I know that our branch does very much appreciate it. I want to acknowledge and thank Kathleen Plimsoll and her son Christian for coming here tonight. The last time I met Kathleen was in 2019 at the Plimsoll Lecture when Ambassador of the EU, then Michael Push, came to speak here. So it's great to see your commitment to the Institute and to this lecture in particular. I want to thank Kim, of course, Kim Boyer. I was chatting with somebody in the foyer earlier today, and I mentioned the outstanding energy that Tasmania has within our organisation. And somebody said, "Well, yes, of course, that's partly down to the Kim Boyer effect." So thanks, Kim, for all your efforts, and of course to the efforts of your. And thank you, Tim, for being here and giving the vote of thanks. I also want to acknowledge in the audience tonight we've had several board members of the AIIA. We heard from Zara Kempton, of course, the vice president. She always chimes in, doesn't she? And we have fellows in the online audience, but also a fellow here tonight, Tony Press, who was inducted as a fellow of the AIIA, and he'll be giving his speech shortly. Because, of course, this is not only the Plimsoll Lecture and a talk by the incoming president of the AIIA. It is, of course, the presentation of the AIIA Fellowship. This fellowship is awarded to individuals with a connection of Australia who have made a significant contribution to international affairs. And it's not, we take pride in the Institute as not just catering to the policy community or to a particular group like young people or the business community, but to all Australians. For those of you who have tuned into the current president's podcast, I take pride that I came up with this slogan that is repeated every time on the podcast, that we want Australians, and it's all Australians, to know more, understand more, and engage more in international affairs. And that's why I'm proud that we're across the country. We're the only country of our kind to have branches in every state and territory in the capital. We have speakers like the eminent businessman Warwick Smith, who also received an AAA fellowship just last week, wasn't it, here in Tasmania. So it's great that Tasmania plays such an active role. But here, of course, tonight we're here to honour Heather Smith, and I can think no one more suited to receive a fellowship of the AAA, but also to become the president of the AAA. I won't go into her bio, you've already heard it, but suffice to say, she crosses a lot of boundaries in areas that are relevant to international affairs, business, academia, think tanks, and of course the public sector. So I'm extremely pleased to award her this fellowship, and I'm extremely pleased that she's going to become the president of the AAA. When I told her that she would be receiving something like this, I said to her, Heather, please make space in your suitcase for something that's about the size of a bottle of wine. And she said, that's really great it'll be really great to meet you in Tasmania, and I'm looking forward to the vino. So, Heather, I'm sorry. This is quite possibly the first of a long line of disappointments, but I'm glad to present it to you nonetheless.
Thanks very much, Bryce. And thank you again to our wonderful speaker for this evening's Plimsoll Lecture, Dr. Heather Smith. We're really grateful that you've joined us tonight here in Hobart. And I hope that our audience, both online and in the room, have enjoyed the presentation. You're going to be able to find it in the future on the AIIA website and also on the usual UTAS outlets. Our next event in the Island of Ideas series focuses on the mental health gap. And so for those of you who are keen to continue these conversations, it will be held on Wednesday, the 7th of December. And then, of course, we'll be back in the new year with a wonderful series of future events. The event for the 7th of December, we will be joined by one of the most celebrated psychologists in the field of anxiety and depression, also a graduate of the University of Tasmania, Professor Michelle Krasky, AO. So please do, if you have the time, tune in for that event where Michelle's going to be explaining her program for screening, tracking and treating anxiety and depression. And I think fair to say, Heather, in the context of the challenges we see at the global stage, it's important that we are all focused on individual and social health, including mental health here in Australia. So on that note, please join me one last time in thanking our 2022 lecturer. Thank you very much, everyone, and good evening from Hobart.